You can't sleep. The pressures of tomorrow have only mounted as the time slowly ticks towards the morning. Tomorrow's vote will be the most important of your career, possibly your life. You have the opportunity to change the lives of millions of people, and it's not something you take lightly. The morning comes, as it always does, and on your walk to the Tennessee state capitol, you are reminded of your mother's words. Don't forget to be a good boy, she said. Help Mrs. Cat with her rats. You, of course, know what she means and what she expects of you. You, Harry Byrne, are the swing vote, cast in favor of ratifying the 19th Amendment and giving millions of American women the right to vote. At long last, the struggle is over and the war is won. Howdy, y'all. Welcome back to Nicsgemini Yaps, a show where I talk about historical topics that interest me and subject you all to it. This is your first time here. My name is Nicole. I go by Nicsgemini here on YouTube and elsewhere online, and this is me putting my history degree to work. If you are not new here and you're coming from my first video, welcome back. I'm so glad to see you again. Leave me a comment saying hello or something, or tell me how bad of a job I'm doing. Since I'm pretty sure it's mostly my friends and family here, again, I really want to thank all of you for being here. I wouldn't be the person I am today without you. The main goal or thesis of my channel is to talk about historical things that interest me, but in a way that is approachable and fun. I think the reason why a lot of people say they don't like history is because they haven't had someone make it engaging for them. I was very lucky and blessed to have amazing history teachers on my education journey, and they made me into the historian and the educator that I am today. I want to name drop them here, but I guess I'll keep it private. The ones who were my teacher, they know if they ever see this. Thank you. Genuinely, from the bottom of my heart. Thank you. Right. So I wrote most of this script back in March of this year, actually, when I first conceived the idea for this channel. I'm really, really passionate about women's rights, and I love studying about all my sisters who came before me. I take voting very seriously, and it's mostly in part to the Schoolhouse Rock song on women's suffrage that I watched many, many times growing up. Shout out to my mom, again, for being a Schoolhouse Rock mom, because I learned so much watching those little shorts. I'm also going to make this one as kid-friendly as possible and not swear as much so my friends' kids can watch too. So the script was actually conceived from a essay that I wrote my senior year of college. It was actually my capstone course that I had to take in order to get my degree. So I had to write a big, long 20-page research paper on women's suffrage with World War I as the backdrop. And so I basically just took that essay and converted it into a script and made it more fun. So because this is my own written work, I'm going to give a little disclaimer on this. This paper was submitted, graded, and contributed towards my degree. It's by no means perfect or even groundbreaking in the realm of women's studies, but I think I got a B on it. It's just a topic that I've always held near and dear to my heart. I will also link the sources that I used in my essay and any others that I came across when I was researching. It's mainly for pictures. The bulk of my research came from the materials that I used in order to write the paper, but I used like Wikipedia and stuff to kind of write the intro information and also to find pictures because that's the easiest way. And a lot of their stuff's open source, so it's like easy to use without any copyright. So yeah, they have their sources listed on the pages, as I'm sure most of you know. And honestly, this is just for fun, so I'm not going to take this too seriously. I don't think you should take this too seriously. I'm also not going to read my essay word for word because it was an academic paper and that would be really boring. So yeah, I tried to make this as fun as possible. So I think that's it for my disclaimer. So let's go. I also want to say this before I get going. The right to vote that would eventually be won here only benefited white women at this time. Women of color wouldn't be able to vote freely until 1965, when the Voting Rights Act was passed and removed all the barriers that prevented them from voting, like literacy tests, poll taxes, and intimidation. However, there are still minority voices in the story that deserve to have their stories told. They struggled and fought for this right just as much, if not more, than the white women who got all the credit. So, again, and I want to say, if you remember from my last video, I said that none of this was that long ago. 1965 was really not that long ago. My dad was born in 1968. So, 3 years after my dad was born, that's not that long ago. So the struggle for women's right to vote started a few decades before we actually got it. The first event that's usually pointed to as like the catalyst for the big push is the Seneca Falls Convention, which is commonly referred to as the first women's right convention. I'll have a picture of their declaration of sentiments here. That was basically a document where they all talked about the things that men did to women. It was a really long complaint list akin to the Declaration of Independence, which is why they called it the Declaration of Sentiments. They were hearkening back to the Declaration of Independence and what it was used for. It was held July 19th through the 20th, 1848, in the town of Seneca Falls in New York. This convention would soon spawn many other women's rights conventions all over the state of New York. 1850 saw the first in a series of national women's rights conventions kickstarting in Massachusetts. Again, if you remember from my last video, the Donner Party set out in 1846, and the first women's rights convention is 1848. I just thought that was a really interesting little tidbit. Like, all this stuff is so close together, and I think that's so cool. So some of you might pick up on the year of the first convention, which, as I said, is 1848. So women getting together and talking about women's suffrage, this all started happening. These conversations started happening before the Civil War. Again, I mentioned in my last video, it got cut out, but the Civil War started in 1860 and it ended in 1865. So all of this stuff, all these conversations were happening before the first shots of the American Civil War even happened. Some of the notable speakers at the convention and in women's history in general are Elizabeth Cady Stanton, which I'll have a picture of her here, and Lucretia Mott. These women were at first primarily active in abolitionist groups with their spouses and originally met each other in 1840 at the first World's Anti-Slavery Convention, which was held in London at the time. Their meeting and their long-ass boat ride back home to America had the women coming together and planning their own convention based solely on women's rights, because it's got to be really boring on that boat, because I'm pretty sure at this time it's still a couple-month journey. I'll have to look into it, and I'll put the information here. It might be, they might have cut it down to maybe 1 or 2 months, but I'm pretty sure at this time taking a boat across the Atlantic from Europe to America is about 3 months. Howdy, y'all. I got the mic mounted back onto this freaking stand, but I just had to pop in here and make a quick correction on what I said the travel time is going to be across the Atlantic. So I thought that it was still like 2 to 3 months, but based on my Googling, it looks like it could have been shorter than that, like 6 to 8 weeks. You would think that somebody who loves ocean liners would like kind of know this, but I'm gonna be honest with you. My knowledge on like early ocean liners, like pretty much anything pre-Titanic, is like not that great. Which, I mean, that's my own shortcoming. Why I want to learn more about it or whatever. But yeah, it looks like it's about 6 to 8 weeks, which is still a ridiculously long time to be on a boat. And they just became besties, and I know as a woman, when you make a new bestie, you just want to talk all day. I mean, I have besties now that I just want to talk to them all day. So, and they're together on a boat for months. So, what better activity is there than being delusional with your new bestie? The climate at this time for women was one of control, whether that was from a father, a husband, or even a son. Women couldn't inherit property, sign contracts, serve on juries, or, of course, vote. The job market was terrible, with a very limited selection and really awful pay, typically half of what a man got. And it's this backdrop that we find Elizabeth Cady Stanton giving her first public speech, this time on temperance, which is a whole other debacle. It's basically married to women's suffrage. I'm going to touch on it a little bit later. She has this speech in front of about 100 people, or 100 women at Seneca Falls, moving herself and the crowd to tears. This isn't the convention yet at Seneca Falls. This is just the town of Seneca Falls. After her bestie, Lucretia Mott, moves from Boston to Seneca Falls, the talks for the big convention got more and more delulu and crazy, except not really, because these ladies actually make it happen. Some of the first rights for women began with a bill passed in New York State Assembly on April 7th, 1848. New York had given women who were married the right to inherit their husband's property after they passed away. They also wouldn't have that property seized by any creditors that might need paying off. Mississippi actually passed a similar law in 1839 with an expanded ability to let married women purchase property independently of their husband, which probably doesn't sound that exciting, but the possibilities that come with being a property or landowner that are ones that we take for granted today. Unless you're like me and most other people my age and you can't afford a house now or ever. Thanks a lot, Ronald Reagan. I should do a video on Ronald Reagan and the impacts of his presidency. Anyway, we're moving on. Not long after the property rights bill passed in New York, our girls Elizabeth and Lucretia, with the help of Mary Ann McClintock, Lucretia's sister, Martha Coffin Wright, and Jane Hunt, felt comfortable to start planning their Seneca Falls Convention. The first day of planning was July 9th, 1848. The ladies met up once again a week later to finish planning for the event. It was hosted at this Methodist chapel. Let me see the name. Wesleyan Methodist Chapel in Seneca Falls, which is a common place for events of this nature. Again, like I said, using the Declaration of Independence as the basis for their Declaration of Sentiments, the women drafted their grievances to mankind on a tea table in the home of Mary Ann McClintock. The document listed numerous rights for women that Elizabeth and friends found to be of most importance. She snuck voting rights on there at the end, kind of like a far-off moonshot, and her husband, Henry, helped her edit and cite the document with laws to support their other issues, namely property rights. And when he noticed her addition of suffrage, he warned, quote, "You will turn the proceedings into a farce," end quote. He was one of the many men who did not want women to vote. I'm going to talk about later, but there's a few reasons why men do not want women to vote at this time. I'm going to touch on them a little bit, but they're insane and stupid. Of course they are. The line she included on her grievances about women's suffrage is so awesome that I have to read it verbatim. Okay, this is it. He has never permitted her to exercise her inalienable right to elective franchise, which is such a cool way to say men have prevented women from having the right to vote, and that's a crime. The first day saw speeches from Elizabeth and Lucretia, both women taking turns engaging the women in the audience to take this issue seriously and take charge in their own lives. The Declaration of Sentiments was read aloud twice, with the second reading going paragraph by paragraph in order to discuss it thoroughly. The first day was exclusively for women and their young children, with men being allowed to listen in and participate on the evening of the first day and all of the second day, which I kind of love that, like having the women gathered together for the first reading and then going line by line and talking about why it's important to them. I love it. The second day saw Elizabeth reading the Declaration again, this time for the men in the room. One of her grievances was about a woman's right to property, saying, quote, "He has taken from her all right and property, even to the wages she earns." But to this point, one of the men in the audience, a New York Assemblyman, Ansel Bascom, informed the women of the aforementioned Married Women's Property Act. That's the thing that passed in New York. Frederick Douglass, which I'm going to have a picture of him right now. You should know this legend. You should know him. He's a famous abolitionist, orator, and a writer. He was also in attendance on day 2 of the convention, there to advocate for the women in their plight for more equality. At the convention, he had this to say, quote, "In this denial of the right to participate in government, not merely the degradation of women and the perpetuation of a great injustice happens, but the maiming and repudiation of one half of the moral and intellectual power of the government of the world." I think I might have got lipstick on his mic. If you're watching this part, Brandon, no, I didn't. I'm going to get this point out of the way early because Frederick Douglass touched on this in his speech during the Seneca Falls Convention, and I did mention this earlier as well. Many white women saw the enfranchisement of men of color, many of them former slaves, as an injustice to themselves. Not because they were men and they were women, although they felt that some type of way about that too, but because they saw themselves as superior to them because of their race. Essentially, they felt that they deserved the right to vote before men of color because they were, quote, better than them. In part of his speech at the convention, Douglass mentioned that he could not accept the right to vote as a black man if women could not also. And while I understand his sentiment, the root of this feeling of injustice, at least for many white women, is in white supremacy. At the end of the convention, the sentiments were published in local newspapers, which helped to kick off a number of other women's rights conventions in Rochester, New York, and Ohio, Indiana, and Pennsylvania. 2 years after that first convention, in 1850, the first National Women's Rights Convention was held in Worcester, this town name in Massachusetts. This would kick off a yearly meeting of the minds in the women's rights sphere. The overarching goal of these conventions were a number of women's rights, but suffrage always snuck its way onto the list of topics because, of course, it did. A few of the topics up for debate were property rights, access to education, and employment opportunities. Many folks involved at these conventions saw them as an opportunity to secure more rights for all women, including those still enslaved. Lucy Stone, another lady who honestly deserves her own short video because of all the cool shit she did, She gave a speech that would inspire Susan B. Anthony, which is the suffrage that I'm pretty sure most of you have probably heard of. I'll include a picture of her right here. I'm pretty sure they put her on some coinage. So I'll see if I can find a picture of that. The National Women's Rights Convention was held every year from 1850 until the early rumblings of the Civil War in 1860. Sojourner Truth's, I'm going to have a picture of her here. Sojourner Truth's famous Ain't I a Woman speech was given at the Ohio Women's Rights Convention in 1851. With the outbreak of the war, these conventions quickly pivoted to becoming abolitionist. The right to vote could be picked up later. It was important to ensure the abolition of slavery for obvious reasons. It wasn't until a year after the war ended in 1866 that Susan B. Anthony could convince enough activists to meet up once again. And they held meetings annually until 1869. 1869 was a big year for women's rights in America. The two groups that would form the National American Women's Suffrage Association were founded, one by Susan B. Anthony and Elizabeth Cady Stanton. Hey, girl. And the other founded by Lucy Stone and Frances Ellen Watkins Harper. I'm going to have a picture of her right here because she's also really cool. Frances was born a free woman in Baltimore, Maryland, and is known for being an abolitionist, a suffragist, and a writer, amongst other things. She was one of the first Black women to publish a novel in 1892. I'm going to include a snippet of one of her speeches that she gave at the 1866 National Women's Rights Convention, because I think it's important. We are all bound up together in one great bundle of humanity, and society cannot trample on the weakest and feeblest of its members without receiving the curse in its own soul. You white women here speak of wrongs. I, as a colored woman, have had in this country an education which has made me feel as if I were in the situation of Ishmael, my hand against every man, and every man's hand against me. While there exists this brutal element in society which tramples upon the feeble and treads down the weak, I tell you that if there is any class of people who need to be lifted out of their airy nothings and selfishness, it is the white women of America. This is what I was trying to talk about earlier. White women enjoyed the benefits of a white society while putting their heads in the sand when it comes to specifically issues that are affecting people of color. Even in the associations formed specifically for women's suffrage, the rights of Black women were never fully promoted. It's what makes this topic so frustrating to study and talk about because many of the women in color involved in making this stuff happen for everyone are hardly talked about or remembered. Like, I had to really go out of my way to even find the information about this. And I'm sure I could have dug further. I can always do more. But, I mean, if someone is just doing basic research of women's suffrage and everything that entails, you have to really look for stuff like that. So that's what I mean when I say that it's frustrating. That, like, for anyone wanting to get a basic understanding of a topic such as this, you have to dig far. You have to dig deep in order to find those minority voices. The 15th Amendment gave African American men the right to vote. Suffragists such as our girl earlier, Elizabeth Cady Stanton, and Susan B. Anthony did not support this amendment for the reason I stated earlier. They wanted voting rights for women as well as African American men. Frances Harper was, of course, a supporter of this amendment, not wanting to undermine the advancements of Black men in favor of women's rights. Oh, hold on, Brandon's calling me. And we're back. At the beginning of the video, I had that throwaway comment about temperance and women's suffrage kind of going hand in hand at this time. Well, here's that now. 1873 saw the formation of the Women's Christian Temperance Union, which, if you had a very good history education in high school, you've probably heard about them. Again, I was very, very lucky to have kick-ass history teachers in high school and even in junior high. Anyway, the temperance ladies adopted women's suffrage as one of their tenets that they were going to advocate for. This would somewhat come back to bite them in the ass a little bit because a lot of men were worried, and honestly, rightfully so, that if women got the right to vote, they would vote for prohibition, which prohibition means it's the banning of the sale of alcohol. I'm not sure if it also bans consumption. I don't think so because, I mean, people, I think, could make their own alcohol at home, but it prohibited the selling of alcohol. And they did not want that. That passed anyway in 1917 with the 18th Amendment, 3 years before women got the right to vote. So, I mean, did it really matter in the end? The men themselves passed it, so. Other men were afraid that if women got the right to vote, they would vote to get rid of, I'm not even kidding, child labor. They were afraid that the women were going to vote against child labor. 1869 saw the adoption of what will be called the New Departure, a strategy created by husband and wife suffragist Frances and Virginia Minor. I wanted to mention this specifically because it uses an argument based on what I think to be one of the most important amendments to the Constitution, if not the most important, which is the 14th. In case you don't know what the 14th Amendment is, it's commonly referred to as the Equal Protection Clause, and it's quite simple. I'll read it to you verbatim. It states, all persons born or naturalized in the United States and subject to the jurisdiction thereof are citizens of the United States and of the state wherein they reside. No state shall make or enforce any law which shall abridge the privileges or immunities of citizens of the United States, nor shall any state deprive any person of life, liberty, or property without due process of the law, nor deny to any person within its jurisdiction the equal protection of the laws. Essentially, what that amendment says is anyone born or naturalized under the jurisdiction or law of the United States enjoys its rights and privileges, which suffragists would later use to argue their right to vote, because the right to vote is a right of the United States and should extend to all persons born or naturalized here. My favorite use of the 14th, and like a more modern day one, is its usage in securing marriage equality in 2015. Because, of course, marriage is a right and a privilege that many marginalized groups have fought for and won because it's a right under United States law. Unfortunately, though, in 1875, the Supreme Court ruled in Harper versus Happersett that the Constitution of the United States does not confer the right of suffrage upon anyone, which I think is a weird oversight, but I mean, whatever. We've seen time and time again in recent history that the Supreme Court has a lot of terrible takes. Okay, after that little detour, let's get back on track and check in and see how the actual right to vote stuff is going. You guys should know me by now. I'm going to get off track. 1870 saw a lot of women trying to vote in the hopes of getting a lawsuit in front of the United States Supreme Court. When they finally got a case in front of them, the aforementioned Minor versus Happersett, they lost the case and pivoted to starting with getting states to give them the right to vote and working from there, which is how a lot of amendments get passed, actually. Usually they'll go state by state, and then when enough states have given a certain right to vote. I mean, we're kind of seeing it right now with, I don't think I can say this word, it's an evil word, going on with a certain green plant that adults can use for fun. We're seeing that get passed recreationally state by state. So that's kind of how it goes for rights like this. The first state to give women the right to vote was Wyoming in 1869. And I'm going to give you a fun fact about that. It's because a lot of women moved there. I'm not sure why. I'm going to look up the reason why, but they gave women the right to vote because a lot of them moved to Wyoming in 1869. I think it's because at this time, this is like a, oh my gosh, what's that book called? Something Jane, where this man he like puts in a mail-in order for a wife and she shows up and she's kind of plain. Oh my God, this is going to bother me. I'm going to put the name of the book over here. I think it's a situation like that why a lot of women ended up in Wyoming. Hi, editing Nicole back here again to talk about what I said about Wyoming. So I guess, and this is of no surprise to me, they put that amendment in their state legislature in an attempt to attract more women to the territory of Wyoming because they needed more people to become an official state. And yeah, they, of course, it was, I mean, a racist reason. Are we surprised? They wanted more white women there in the hopes that they could attract more men. And so they were like, if we give the women the right to vote, maybe they'll show up and then the men will follow them. Which, you know, makes sense. And also, the book that I was talking about, I was Googling, trying to find the name of that book, and I literally cannot find it. So if anyone knows what book I'm talking about, I swear I read it in school. And it was about a girl, and I thought that her name was Jane. And like the main character is a guy, and he like puts in a mail order ad for a girl to show up and like take care of his kids or something. I don't remember. I know that that's like such a common trope, but like, I don't even know. All right, let's get back to it. Wyoming gave women the right to vote in their state in 1869, followed by Utah in 1870, Colorado in 1893, Idaho in 1896, Washington in 1910, my beautiful home state of California in 1911, Oregon and Arizona in 1912, Montana in 1914, North Dakota, New York, and Rhode Island in 1917, Louisiana, Oklahoma, and Michigan in 1918. If you weren't keeping count, and I know for a fact that you weren't, that's 15 states giving women the right to vote before the amendment passed in 1920. So this sort of brings us to the turn of the century. And just to give you an idea of how much I didn't get to fully dig into because I'm just one girl with an internet connection and a dream and a prayer, some of the founders of the movement, Susan B. Anthony, Elizabeth Stanton, and one of their girlies, Matilda Jocelyn Gage, they started writing a book titled The History of Women's Suffrage. I'm going to include a picture right here because it was supposed to be a cute little small book that could be printed quickly. It turned into 5,700 pages that took 41 years and 6 volumes to write. These books are massive. It started in 1876 and ended its 6-volume run in 1920, long after the deaths of the originators. However, the ladies who wrote it were a little petty about who was going to be included, and so they left out important details about the rival groups, so historians have been working to research and uncover more information about other groups that were active at the time. But thanks, I guess? Anything that is written down in any form can be helpful in preserving human history, even that beautifully constructed Omegaverse fan fiction I know some of you have written. Thank you for your contribution to the historical record. Yes, for you. Okay, for real this time, let's get back on track. Every time I say that, I just have to laugh. The two main rival suffrage groups at the turn of the century were the American Women's Suffrage Association and the National Women's Suffrage Association. These names and acronyms, their acronyms are going to get crazy. After years of rivalry, I have a really hard time with that word, they finally decided to team up and form the National American Women's Suffrage Association. I'll have a picture of its logo or something right here, with the leaders of the group Susan B. Anthony and Lucy Stone agreeing to lead the group together. Of course, the overwhelming rise of racism in the United States, although again, I hesitate to call it a rise. It's always been there and it still is here. But it's going to be referred to as such for the sake of this next point. The sharp increase in racist policies post-Civil War that were all the rage in the southern states had a large impact on the NAWSA. This is going to be tough to say that acronym, as they were somewhat forced to accommodate these white supremacist ideologies in order to gain the vote in some of these southern states. This proto-southern strategy, which if I talk about the history of the Republican Party and Richard Nixon and Reagan, I'm going to talk about the southern strategy. It saw these privileged upper-class Southern belles with strong ties to the church and wealth in the South actually argue that giving women the right to vote would purify society. And even though enfranchising all women would include black women, white women still outnumbered them, so it wouldn't matter. This strategy did nothing, though, and no Southern states gave women the right to vote as a result, except for the ones I mentioned earlier. The impacts of this would still be felt in the NAWSA, however, as Susie B. had to uninvite her longtime friend, Frederick Douglass, that legend I mentioned earlier, from the 1903 convention for suffrage held in Atlanta, the first suffrage convention held in the South. And the NAWSA leadership would later walk these practices back and confirm they had no intention of, quote, excluding any race or class from the right of suffrage. It's still weird, though. You still excluded one of your longtime friends. With the rise of segregation in this country, this was reflected in groups like the NAWSA. Black Americans were forced to create their own activist groups to campaign for their own civil rights because they could no longer trust the people they had been working alongside for decades. Insane how the NAWSA literally had roots in abolitionist movements and still went the way of segregation just to further their own interests. That's really frustrating. All of what I had just talked about, though, this is barely skimming the surface. I haven't even gotten to the stuff I talked about in my essay. This is literally all background information, and it's not even enough. But I kind of want to dig into what I wrote. So I think this is enough background information for now. So here we go, for real this time. My essay specifically mentions World War I as the backdrop for women gaining the right to vote, because it gave women a lot more reasons, as if they needed more, to campaign for the right. They were working a lot of the jobs left behind by men they had created and ran their own societal groups without their husbands, and there was still the country to run while they were gone. Without the war to force that door open, it's impossible to know how much longer women would have had to wait. President Woodrow Wilson had just passed the Selective Service Act, which called upon the nation to, quote, volunteer in mass. And that call was for everyone, not just able-bodied men to sign up for the draft. Women really stepped up when it came to volunteer work. It was socially unacceptable to not do things to bolster the war effort back home. We've gone 30 minutes. Time for a drink of water. New water bottle just dropped. Not new to me, but new to y'all. As I talked about a little bit in the background section, people formed groups and clubs for everything, and at this time were definitely segregated. African-American women had formed their own group to campaign for their rights and support their communities, which is called the National Association of Colored Women. I'm going to have their logo right here. They fought for their right to vote and campaigned heavily against Jim Crow laws in the South. They saw themselves as a way to uplift all African Americans, and without the women of this group, they would not have had a voice in the fight for suffrage. The big group I mentioned before, the NAWSA, they were the big dog on scene for women's suffrage. And while there were many offshoots, the one I really love talking about is called the National Women's Party, created by Alice Paul. This girl was ambitious, college educated, and ready to fight God if she had to for the right to vote. You know how Franklin Graves was my goat in the last story? Alice Paul is my goat in this story. I love her. She went to England in 1907 after finishing her master's degree at the University of Pennsylvania and was deeply involved in the suffrage movement there. She would end up meeting her bestie, Lucy Burns, another American, in a British jail after they were both arrested for their activities in the movement there. And it would end up being a common occurrence for these two. These two girls ended up in jail a lot, as besties do, of course. Back in the States, Alice organized a protest on Inauguration Day for Woodrow Wilson. She organized 8,000 people to march on the Capitol. After realizing her more militant way of doing things, she left the NAWSA and created the NWP, setting up shop right across the street from the White House. And like I said earlier, she'd fight just about anyone for her ideologies, and she didn't budge an inch. She hated the so-called culture of obligation that was posed so heavily in groups and clubs at the time. First ever picketing lines ever established in front of the White House were because of Alice Paul and her NWP baddies, okay? The best sign that they held up called out the president directly, saying, quote, "I'm gonna have a picture up here while I read it. Kaiser Wilson, have you forgotten your sympathy with the poor Germans because they were not self-governed? 20 million American women are not self-governed. Take the beam out of your own eye." Love it. The NWP kept these pickets going every single day, except Sundays, for over a year. At first, President Wilson kind of saw them as cute, and he would like send out coffee and snacks. It's like, "Oh, the girls are protesting in front of my house again. I'm just gonna send them coffee and snacks." Like, then he realized that these ladies were not messing around and that they meant business. They had a meeting scheduled with him in March of 1917 to talk about suffrage, and when it came time for the meeting to start, the gate was not only locked, but this asshole was speeding off in his limousine. Like, that's like cartoon level stuff. Like, they get to the gate and they try to open it. It's locked. And then they hear, and they look up and he's leaving in his limousine. Like, what? Once the United States was actually in the war, the Silent Sentinels were being physically attacked for their peaceful protests outside the White House. Instead of protecting them, police officers would throw them in jail. Once Alice and all her baddie friends found themselves in jail, she organized a hunger strike. She was in that shit for 7 whole months. And when she got out, you better believe she was in the media talking about the shit that they did to her. She said that they would force tubes through her nose, they would tie her down with sheets, they would force the tube down her throat. These interviews would prove to be successful, with Wilson publicly supporting suffrage in 1918. While the efforts of Alice Paul and the NWP would eventually prove to be successful, there are many men and women who were not in support of the vote. There were just as many arguments for suffrage as there were against suffrage. There were entire countergroups dedicated to blocking suffrage from being granted. Anti-suffragists took out whole spreads in newspapers attacking the suffragists and their movement. One newspaper in Tulsa, Oklahoma, to nobody's surprise, had an entire page equating supporting suffrage to discrimination against mother. I'll have it right here. This argument was in effect from the much larger fears at the time of political corruption. The same page lists different reasons why mothers can't or won't vote, saying, quote, "Who would vote if women's suffrage came? Not the mothers. They are too busy to engage in politics, and they seldom vote." This argument is in direct opposition to the fact that women during the war worked jobs that men left behind, spent any free time volunteering to support the war effort, and still raised their children. This idea that women, specifically mothers, are too busy to vote is antiquated even for this era. I want to show off some of these comics and pamphlets on screen because they kind of just made me laugh in a sad way, if that makes sense. Like, God forbid a man have to stay home with his kids so his wife can vote. That makes no sense to me at all. I mean, they also portray the work that women typically did in such a negative way because they were conscious of the amount of work that goes into maintaining a home. It's really frustrating and invalidating. Like, this right here, the one of him, I think, like, holding all the babies or whatever, it's always related to that. It's always about childcare. Like, you know that it's hard work. You know that. Anyway, I'm going to move on. There were some women who opposed suffrage simply because they felt it interfered with the war. The Women Voters Anti-Suffrage Party of New York signed a petition to the Senate urging them not to consider suffrage while the country was, quote, engaged in the greatest war in history. They argued that the men should be, quote, spared the harassing that would come with passing the 19th Amendment, as though the Senate couldn't focus on two things at once. There was no better time than now to give women the right to vote. They had proven time and again that they could be trusted with the right to vote, and they had done plenty to earn it. Well, I can see why people would argue that women like Alice Paul and the NWP were a little too militant in their methods of protest. Their actions got people talking. And even if they were only talking about how much they didn't agree, it still got her name in the press and her cause in the press. And I mean, there's that classic saying that all press is good press, right? Again, the group that has been consistently left out of the suffrage conversation is African American women. These women had to form their own groups if they wanted to fight for their right to vote. Some suffrage groups were happy to exclude them. At the annual NAWSA conference in 1911, many women were introducing resolutions to be agreed upon. One resolution introduced by a white woman and a black woman was this, quote, resolved that women who are trying to lift themselves out of the class of the disenfranchised recognize that it is as unjust and as undemocratic to disenfranchise human beings on the ground of color as on the ground of sex, end quote. This was blocked, and the NAWSA took a hands-off approach to segregation and indirectly supported white supremacy by allowing NAWSA chapters to remain segregated. Well, it has been acknowledged that abolition and women's suffrage did sprout from the same root. Many women, particularly Southern women, did not wish to share the stage with their African American counterparts. The parade that I talked about earlier that was organized on Inauguration Day of President Woodrow Wilson, Alice Paul, just before her split from the NAWSA, she organized the entire event, like I said, some 8,000 people. And she got her own security and set up the parade route by herself. She had organized all the women into blocks from either location or occupation. And when the Illinois chapter of the NAWSA arrived with their fellow suffragist, Miss Ida Bell Wells, co-founder of the NAACP, they were surprised to discover that she would not be allowed to march with them. Although Alice Paul had previously stated that she, quote, tended to side with African Americans when it came to discussions about race, she was more concerned with the possible negative attention that would arise if she allowed Ida to march with the chapter. Paul had organized a group of African American suffragists to walk at the back of the parade, which is really ironic considering what comes later. A group that was fighting for equal rights for women was actively segregating their own equal rights march. Fortunately, Ida's fellow suffragists ignored Alice and marched alongside her sisters. This parade, while it was before the start of the war, planted the seed for what was to come. Alice Paul had arranged around 500 policemen to guard the parade, and she had a detachment of the U.S. cavalry on standby. She had originally planned for about 2,000 people to participate in this parade, and as I've said, it swelled to 8,000. There were women marching 250 miles from New York City to Washington, D.C. just to participate in the march. Alice was drawing upon what she had learned from the British suffragettes, which is attacking the leader and party in power, and that was the best way to sway them over. She had planned from day one of Wilson's administration to be firm in her principles, and she would stop at nothing to achieve the vote. Like I said, Alice Paul did not come to play. The parade went off largely without a hitch. When they reached the section of Pennsylvania Avenue, known for being the home of a couple taverns and bars, the women started to be harassed and groped and even spit on in some cases, all in front of the police. The men shouted the usual misogynistic things that women have heard for millennia. Quote, why don't you go home and cook dinner? Quote, who is minding the babies? On and on it goes from then until now. Hopefully it stops in my lifetime, right? Right, ladies? Am I right? When the women begged for help from the policemen who were supposed to protect them, they were met with laughter and, quote, I can do nothing with this crowd, and I ain't a-going to try, which, boo. While at the time this seemed to be really unfortunate, the press that came from this event and the lack of a formal police response gave the suffragists the much-needed support from the American public. While they might not have supported suffrage yet, one thing Americans will not stand for is the trouncing of the First Amendment. Unless you are a person of color, in which case it's going to be called looting and raiding. This would be the last peaceful protest President Wilson would get from the suffragists. As I said earlier, Alice Paul would eventually split from the NAWSA to form the MWP. She left for a lot of reasons, but the biggest one was because President Wilson had garnered enough support from the public to justify entering into World War I. The NAWSA saw their only opportunity to get the 19th Amendment passed by backing the president with the war. They chose to abandon their pacifist principles and focus on both suffrage and the war effort. Paul was raised in a Quaker family, and if you know anything about the Quakers, they're pacifist people to a fault. You know, like they're going to be pacifist. That's just their principle. She was not willing to bargain on that, which is a little ironic coming from her, but we love a no war queen. She believed that there was another way to garner support for suffrage that would not require to require her to give up her lifelong values. There was also fear from the leaders in the NAWSA that Paul and her followers were going to seek more militant methods of protest. Another defector from the NAWSA that isn't as popular is Sue White. She was a member of the NAWSA around the same time as Alice Paul. She was born and raised in Tennessee and knew the area very well. She had a way of getting to know people on both sides of the political spectrum, Democrat and Republican, suffragist and anti-suffragist. She could always be seen rubbing elbows with various heads of the Tennessee state. At the start of the war, she kind of fell in line with the other NAWSA members and focused on the war effort as well as suffrage. She saw that what Alice Paul and the NWP were doing in front of the White House, and she was not on board with that. While she didn't support the picketing itself, she understood why the other women were compelled to do so. She's quoted as saying, quote, "I see a determination, at any cost, to show the inconsistency of men and agencies who declare war for the right of Europeans to have a voice in their own governments, while turning a deaf ear to the right of American women to have a voice in their own government." This sentiment was not just felt by Sue White. This was one of the many inconsistencies that suffragists pointed to when making the case for suffrage. This glaring contradiction is the biggest reason why women were able to get that amendment passed. Without the war to point this out, it's impossible to know what the suffragists could have used to apply pressure to get that right. Sue White's split from the NAWSA came around November of 1917. She had heard that a fellow suffragist, Maud Younger, was having trouble finding a place to hold her lectures. She was on a tour of the southern states, giving lectures and trying to convince others to join the cause for suffrage. Sue White, being heavily connected in Tennessee, she went to help her out and tried to convince anyone to give her a space to speak. She was in shock at the treatment of her, and she said, quote, "I saw with my own eyes a situation which was enough to alarm anyone who holds American ideals dear." Wartime brought on a number of issues related to free speech. There were whole newspapers that were shut down. Pacifist professors lost their job from universities. People who were skeptical of the war effort were jailed. And German Americans were accused of disloyalty and treason under souped-up alien and sedition laws. Sue had found herself on the speaking trail with Maud Younger, using all of her political sway to secure locations for her to speak. For the next 5 days, she traveled with her and the NWP. Upon her return home, she discovered that she had been slandered in her hometown newspaper. Not only that, but she received a letter from Miss Carrie Catt, and I include a picture of her here, who was the current leader of the NAWSA. Catt was concerned that Sue had become a sort of double agent, spilling all the secrets of the NAWSA over to the NWP. She said that she only helped Maud because that was her girl, and she felt a civic duty to do so. Her First Amendment rights were being trampled, after all. Took the time to express her frustration at the, quote, abandonment of Southern states in the NAWSA's winning strategy. Eventually, Miss Catt and the NAWSA gave Sue White no option but to leave. She said, quote, "In spite of every effort to curb my militant tendencies, my mind continues to revert to the suggestion of Abigail Adams to her John more than 100 years ago, that ladies might be constrained to foment a rebellion. Is 100 years behind the times conservative enough?" With that sentiment, she left the NAWSA for the NWP. The divisions between these two groups didn't stop there. The hottest issue that these two groups disagreed on was the war. Both groups tried their best to lobby a number of Congress members, including the first Congressman, Jeanette Rankin of Montana, which, when I was looking up a picture of her, I didn't know this. She still is, to this day, the only woman to be elected to Congress from the state of Montana. You have the first congresswoman ever in the history of the whole country, and she's your only congresswoman. Well, how does that even happen? Anyway, she was known to be anti-war, in line with her constituents. However, the NAWSA pushed her almost relentlessly to vote in favor of the war. Under immense pressure, she voted in line with her principles, and she voted no, a move that would anger Carrie Catt and please Alice Paul. She's such a cool lady. She said that the first time a woman had the opportunity to vote no against the war, that she had no choice but to vote no. And as I said earlier, still the only woman representative to come out of Montana. Also, when I was looking into her information, I saw that she had died in 1973, which is the year my mom was born. Again, remember when I said that all of this stuff was not that long ago? This is literally within my parents' lifetime. With war on the horizon, the message and strategy of the NWP changed. With Wilson giving speeches about fighting for democracy and the right to have a voice in one's own government, Alice saw this as a turning point and, quote, "That's when the militancy really began." as if it wasn't happening enough already. Now, infamous signs that the women held in front of the White House began to appear. The first in a series of many, Lucy Burns and her fellow suffragist Dora Lewis held a sign in front of a Russian envoy that said, "To the Russian envoys, we, the women of America, tell you that America is not a democracy. 20 million American women are denied the right to vote. President Wilson is the chief opponent of their national enfranchisement. Help us make this nation really free. Tell our government it must liberate its people before it can claim free Russia as an ally." Love it. This made a large number of passerbys very angry. The women were called traitors, accused of being sympathetic to the Germans, and eventually they were attacked, like physically attacked. Alice Paul, ever the media darling, she called it how she saw it. Quote, "The responsibility is with the government and not with the women of America. If the lack of democracy at home weakens the government in its fight for democracy 3,000 miles away." Basically, in modern terms, Alice was calling out the government for being a champion of democracy everywhere but home. Alice and her suffragists would be put to the test again once the arrests began. As I said earlier, Alice and some of her compatriots were eventually arrested and jailed for their participation in the protests outside the White House. The details of their treatment is truly harrowing, and Alice and some of the other women, they went on lengthy hunger strikes to get their point across. Again, always thinking about the press coverage, Alice noted how the media would have full coverage of their arrest because it occurred on July 4th. This would stave off the arrest for a few months before starting up again in earnest. On October 20th, 1917, Alice Paul was arrested along with some other NWP members. She was sentenced for 7 months in jail for her protesting. In her book, Votes for Women, American Suffragists, and the Battle for the Ballot, Winifred Conkling describes in detail what life was like for the women who were arrested. Quote, "While in jail, the suffragists slept on blankets that were washed only once a year. They drank from cups dipped directly into an open pail of dirty water. They shared a single piece of soap. They had to use the toilet in open stalls in front of male prison guards. And to top it off, they were also, quote, denied access to toothbrushes, combs, and toilet paper. Understandably, some of the men married to these women would do anything to keep them out of jail. But interestingly, some men were very supportive of their wife's decision, and that author, Conkling, points out that one man who had just recovered from a stroke told his wife that he'd be just fine without her. Wow, since I read that book. I had to read it for college, and that's been a couple years now already, but I should read it again. Paul knew that it would be a matter of time before word got out about the way she was treated in jail. She decided to take things even further by announcing that hunger strike I mentioned earlier. And this would be something that trickled down to all her little baddie friends that were in jail with her. Conkling also details the lengths that the warden went to try to break their strike. He thought it would be a good use of funds to buy them like fried chicken and fresh salads and veggies, and then when that didn't work, that's when they began to force feed them. The description provided by these women is terrifying. A number of women report passing out, vomiting, nosebleeds, soreness. Alice herself would be isolated from the group and put into solitary confinement for protesting, by the way. Protesting. She's put in solitary confinement. Her windows were covered up and bolted shut. She was constantly awoken from sleep and unknowingly was under some sort of psych evaluation. The doctor who was evaluating her came in to ask her about her cause. She proceeded to give a lengthy lecture on suffrage, fully aware and obviously not insane. To the surprise of a lot of people, though, he declared her mentally sane at a time when he could have very easily said that she was insane and like nobody would question him. After about a month of jail time, the women were finally seen in court. Upon hearing the gruesome and harrowing tales these women had about their imprisonment, the women were removed from the workhouse that they were in into an abandoned jail to serve out the remainder of their sentence. Again, Conkling describes a strangely funny story of the man in charge of cooking food for these women. He hired 6 more women to cook them ham and bacon nonstop. And he's quoted as saying, quote, I have to read this. I kept those cooks busy day and night frying ham. I was convinced that the fragrance of frying ham was the greatest stimulus to appetite known to man. It was terribly hard on the women. The hunger strike would prove to be successful, except for the pigs used to cook all that bacon and ham. Wilson had agreed to release the women and pardon them, but the cook basically saying, yeah, the smell of cooking bacon would literally make anyone hungry is such a man thing to say, and it's so funny, I had to leave it in. The pacifists that could be found within the ranks of the women's suffrage groups were far from the only ones in the country at the time. Woodrow Wilson ran his re-election campaign on the promise of, quote, he kept us out of war, unaware that he would be calling on the American people to support the war overseas just a couple months later. While he technically did break his promise to keep the nation out of war, he did strive for an enduring peace, both with other nations and the suffragists. On a tour of the country in October of 1919, just after the passing of the 19th Amendment by Congress, President Wilson suffered a stroke. Once he was rushed back to the White House and stable, his wife, Edith Wilson, secretly took over, reading documents definitely not meant for her to see, to deem them worthy of the potential stress that it could cause her husband. One of these stressors for years at this point had been the suffragists. Edith Wilson could not stand these women. She frequently referred to them as disgusting creatures and detestable. However, she had a front row seat to her husband's opinion on suffrage slowly changing. This is in part due to the newfound standing that America had in the world after World War II. This country was supposed to be a beacon of democracy, so the law should reflect that. It also helped that President Wilson and Carrie Catt had a successful professional relationship. She was able to get him the support that he needed to win the war. She turned a large group of women into a war effort support machine at great cost to her own personal ideals, so the president owed her big time. Wilson would do all he could to deliver on that favor. He was instrumental in garnering the last few votes needed in the House of Representatives to pass the 19th Amendment. Both Alice Paul and Carrie Catt would take credit for this victory. Both had demonstrated different methods of protest, and both achieved the result that they wanted. President Wilson addressed the Senate directly, saying, quote, we have made partners of the women in this war. Shall we admit them only to a partnership of suffering and sacrifice and toil, and not to a partnership of privilege and right? Women had successfully stepped into their new roles that 5 million men left behind. They took on new jobs and raised their children all on their own. The road to suffrage was longer still. The amendment narrowly passed in the House with a vote of 274 to 136. Although this was a big victory for the suffragists, the amendment still had to pass the Senate, because I'm sure a lot of you don't know or don't remember how the American government works, and it is very confusing. The two branches of Congress are the House of Representatives and the Senate. If anything wants to get passed, a bill is introduced in the House of Representatives, it's voted on, and then if it passes the House, it goes on to the Senate, where it's voted on by the members of the Senate. And for an amendment, after it passes both of those two branches of Congress, it needs to go to the states in order for the amendment to be ratified and added to the Constitution, which is why amendments don't get added very often, because it's a very long process and you need to get a lot of people to agree on something, which is very rare in this country. Even though the amendment passed the House, it would take 8 months before the Senate even heard the vote. And once they finally had, they fell just short of the 2/3 that it needed to pass. Like clockwork, Alice Paul and the NWP ramped up the protests, this time with some danger. The women began lighting bonfires on the open streets and burning any Wilson speech that talked about democracy. Paul said of the fires, quote, it was really very dramatic, because when President Wilson went to Paris for the peace conference, he was always issuing some wonderful, idealistic statement that was impossible to reconcile with what he was doing at home. The protests would again go up a notch on the day Congress was set to vote on the amendment again. The women had created a small effigy meant to resemble the president, and they tossed it into their bonfire to a chorus of cheers from the crowd. All of these efforts would again be in vain, as the 19th Amendment failed in the Senate for the second time, however, with only one vote short. Okay, so when I was talking about the women burning that effigy of the president, I was imagining this video. I don't know if you guys have ever seen it. It's all over Twitter, but it's this video of witches flying around a fire in a circle. This is what I'm imagining when I read that. And the first result I found for this video when I was looking for it had Zimzelabim by Red Velvet playing over it, which as a casual Reveillev I thought was really funny. If anyone knows that song, you'll understand why it's funny to have that song playing over this video. Later on in the summer of 1919, Congress would come together to vote on the 19th. It passed the House with a vote of 304 to 89, where it was sent to the Senate for the final vote. Finally, on June 4th, 1919, a day before my birthday, after decades of work, thousands of women advocating for their rights, the Senate passed the 19th Amendment with a vote of 56 to 25. While this was a very well-deserved and hard-fought triumph, the work to get the amendment ratified began, and it, like I said earlier, required 3/4 of all the states. And the clock was ticking for ratification of the 19th Amendment. Many suffragists knew they only had until 1920's election to get this pushed through the states before the pendulum inevitably swung again in the Republicans' favor. The anti-suffragists were aware of this same scenario, hoping to wait out the, quote, fad. At first, it went rather quickly. Wisconsin ratified less than a week after the signing of the amendment in Congress. The next 13 states to ratify the amendment would all happen in quick succession, and there would be hardly any movement on the ratifying process until the spring of 1920. By that point, 35 states had agreed to ratify, with states in the Deep South like Mississippi, Louisiana, and Georgia being a few to vote no. That just left little old Tennessee as the swing state. And they had a Democratic governor by the name of Albert H. Roberts, and he was up for re-election. So getting him to push his fellow statesmen to vote for suffrage could be potentially very costly for his career, which I really hate that our politicians make decisions based on their re-election results, whatever. A telegram from the president and tons of lobbying, the Tennessee state legislature opened up their special session on August 9th, 1920. The state senate had no issues ratifying the amendment, and it passed 25-4. The state house, however, was subject to numerous attacks from neighboring states, encouraging them to fight, quote, to the last ditch and then some. Everyone knew it would be a really hard-fought battle. Suffragists and antis alike were rubbing elbows with the Tennessee representatives. Mrs. Catt of the NAWSA had heard rumors that the antis were buying votes. The suffragists weren't entirely clear of wrongdoing either, as many of the women were seen flirting with representatives and hosting lavish dinner parties to convince these men that suffrage was essential, which, slay queens, make misogyny work for you. Tennessee House representatives debated the amendment for 5 days. On August 18th, 1920, the time had finally come to vote. The first attempt ended in a tie, forcing another vote. In order for this amendment to pass and be ratified officially, it would take one swing vote. Conkling again describes a wonderful story about State Congressman Harry Burns, the guy that I mentioned in the intro. He's the one to flip. His mother was pro-suffrage, and prior to the vote had written her son a 7-page letter saying, quote, "Don't forget to be a good boy and help Mrs. Thomas Catt with her rats." He would later go on to justify his switch and say, quote, and this quote is so awesome, "I appreciated the fact that an opportunity, seldom as such, comes to a mortal man to free 17 million women from political slavery was mine." Of course, his mother helped change his mood, which, I mean, again, oh, it's such a cool quote, and what an opportunity. The story often left out of the suffrage movement is one about the anti-suffragists. I kind of talked about them earlier. I kind of peppered in some of their stories here and there, but they're just as much a part of this story as the suffragists. There were groups of men and women from all over the country that did not agree with extending the right to vote towards women. Most of them didn't want to take away from the giant war happening in Europe. A large advocate against suffrage was a woman named Charlotte Rowe. She had joined the anti-suffrage movement at its earliest roots in New York around 1911. The group that typically subscribed to the anti-suffrage beliefs were just afraid of more change. Elaine Weiss in The Women's Hour provides a comprehensive list of the usual person found at an anti-suffrage rally. Quote, "Standing under the anti-umbrella were men of the cloth and women of the club, corporate titans and black and immigrant working men, political bosses and university professors, united only by their dread of yet another element of upheaval." And Charlotte Rowe was very talented at appealing to these types of people. The core of the anti-suffrage argument was, of course, based in rampant sexism. The idea that women couldn't or shouldn't have any dreams of achieving more than being a housewife wasn't new, and is still around in fringe groups to this day. Radwife communities, I'm looking at you. Really hard and very judgmentally. The women that fought against these ideas during this time had to fight against bunk science laid out clearly by Weiss, that author I mentioned earlier. Quote, "They had to beat back the accepted medical wisdom that strenuous thinking harmed a woman's reproductive organs, draining the lifeblood from her ovaries to her brain. Unfortunately, for the people who believe in these gender norms, are in for a huge shock when the flappers come into popularity in a couple short years. Sucks to suck." Luckily for modern women, the 19th Amendment was passed, and not a moment too soon. It's hard for historians to look back and at all the events that happened to this point and choose one specific piece of the puzzle that was absolutely instrumental in getting it passed. The actions of all the women who fought for their fellow suffrage sisters are all valuable and essential to the story of women's suffrage. World War I was the backdrop that all of these scenes would play out against. Without the urgency and the stress that the war placed on these women, it's impossible to know if any other time would have given them the opportunity to push for this right. The importance of this event could be felt in ripples across the country. The sky was the limit for these women who now had access to the right to vote. A cartoonist by the name of Elmer Andrews Bushnell published a comic that perfectly depicts all of the possibilities now available to women. I'll, of course, include a picture. It's kind of hard to read, but the role of presidency is written on the top rung. The women who were left behind when the war started stepped into huge roles left behind by their husbands, fathers, and brothers. They took on these new challenges in stride, taking on new jobs, raising their children, and finding the time to fight for equal rights. The spirit of volunteering and the sacrifice that Wilson called for in his selective service speech was the predecessor to all of the energy that these women gathered in their push for voting rights. Every person in the story was in the right place at the right time, doing exactly what needed to be done. The two heavy hitters in the story, Carrie Catt and Alice Paul, continued to fight for women's rights until their dying day. Mrs. Catt made good on her promise to dedicate the rest of her life to anti-war and pacifist efforts after having to give up those values to get closer to President Wilson. She would go on to lobby Congress to make the entry of Jewish immigrants easier after seeing many of them fleeing what would become Nazi Germany. Alice Paul would stay much closer to home and work with her beloved National Women's Party. She would work with Sue White, the well-connected Tennessee woman, and together they would pen what was to be the still not ratify Equal Rights Amendment. Though the tides are changing now, finding any information about African American suffragists is difficult. They're usually covered in maybe a section of a chapter or maybe even a whole chapter in a book about white women fighting for suffrage. The truth is that they were there, fighting just as hard, if not harder, than their white counterparts. The right to vote has so much more meaning to someone who has been disenfranchised and dehumanized for hundreds of years. Not even African American men serving in the war alongside their fellow white Americans was enough to spare them from segregation, voter suppression laws, and the Klan. The road to suffrage began long before the war years of the 1910s. Starting with the convention at Seneca Falls and ending in the Tennessee state capitol, the road has been decades long, with some women around to see the end of the fight, not even old enough to remember Seneca Falls or even born at the time of Seneca Falls. And while it can't be proven with absolute certainty, World War I and its impact on the home front played a major role in the road to the 19th. Women like Alice Paul and the NWP called out the hypocrisy of a government fighting for democracy, all the while denying it back home, and the strength the women demonstrated when the 5 million men were called up to fight were gone, leading to the huge swing in public opinion on suffrage. Women who started the war as a volunteer knitter of socks could have ended as a suffragist, protesting alongside Paul or campaigning with Catt. The organizations and clubs environment that absorbed American culture at this time also played a huge role in the formation of these suffrage groups. It's also interesting to draw parallels between the suffragists of the World War I era and the modern-day feminists. The picketing outside the White House for equal rights for all Americans can trace their roots back to the first White House picketers ever, those silent sentinels. The idea to march on Inauguration Day can also be traced back to Alice Paul and her NWP. History may not always repeat itself, but it certainly can rhyme. All American women today can thank the tireless efforts of these women and men, I guess, who fought so hard for a right that is so easily taken for granted today. The final goal of the suffragists from so long ago will finally be achieved when this country elects a woman as its president, and I'll be damned if I'm not alive to see it. Well, a little bit of a shorter one today. That concludes this video. Let me know what you guys think, and if there's people out there who have corrections for me or feel like I should have included somebody that I didn't, let me know. I love talking about women's rights and learning new things. Or if you did learn something new from me and you want to talk about it, also let me know. This video, like I said, was inspired by my senior thesis that I had to write in order to get my BA, so that's why some parts might sound a little formal compared to how I usually speak. I tried to informalize it up in some parts, but, you know, it came out how it came out, I guess. I don't have any backup scripts now. I do not know what to talk about next, and it's a little bit scary. Maybe I'll put it to a vote. But the ideas that I'm thinking of are the Queen Mary, Alcatraz, the California Mission System, Hearst Castle, or the Winchester Mystery House. Those are just a few of my ideas. Y'all let me know what you want to see. I'm going to get out of here, though. I mean, this video's only been an hour. My last one was 2 hours. So a little short one for you guys today. But anyway, I'm starting my credential program, and I'm starting student teaching, and I'm also going back to work as a sub. So hopefully I'll find some time to writing and making videos. I really enjoyed making these too. It brought out a sort of creativity, I guess, that I either didn't know I had or didn't realize I could tap into. It was really fulfilling for me to make these. So again, thank you all for taking the time to listen to me. I really appreciate it. I'll see you when I see you. Bye.